How does a 7, 9-year-old rancher with no thermal scope, no cellular cameras, and a feeder that cost him $80 at a farm supply store consistently kill more hogs per hunt than guys running $2,000 worth of night hunting equipment on the same type of property? That was the question I was trying to answer in 2019 when a neighbor of mine in Lafleur County introduced me to Earl Spivey, who had been running cattle and shooting hogs on his property outside of Talihina for what he described as since before you were born, which in my case was accurate. I had been hunting hogs for going on 8 years at that point and averaging 2 to 3 animals per hunt on a good night. Earl was averaging 9 to 11 on a mediocre night. The difference was not equipment. It was how he ran his feeders, specifically the timing sequence he had built through trial and error over decades. And it is completely counterintuitive to how every hog hunting article I had ever read described feeder management. Near the end, I'm going to cover the specific modification he makes in the 2 weeks before a planned hunt that accounts for most of the difference between his results and everyone else's. Before I explain the mechanism, the setup context that makes this work. Earl's property is about 400 acres of mixed timber and ag field edge in the Ouachita foothills, with a creek bottom running through the southeast corner where hogs bed. Classic East Oklahoma terrain, dense cover transitions into open pasture. Hogs use the creek corridor to move between bedding and feeding. Standard setup that many of you hunt on similar ground. He runs 3 feeders. None of them are fancy. All of them have been in the same location for more than 10 years. What Earl does that I had never seen described anywhere is called a variable interval feeding schedule. Most hunters set their feeder timers to fire at fixed times, usually dawn and dusk, maybe adding a midday spin. That consistency is the problem. Here is why. A hog that learns a feeder, fires at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., is not actually being drawn to the feeder at those times because it is hungry. It is responding to a conditioned behavioral pattern. The same way you know your phone buzzes when you get a message, the hog knows the feeder disperses corn at predictable times. Conditioned responses in animals, including hogs, include an automatic risk assessment component. A sound or scent that is always present at a specific time and location eventually gets categorized as a known stimulus rather than an excitement trigger. The hog approaches the feeder on schedule, but on a schedule it has worked out for itself, which on pressured properties means the schedule shifts progressively later into the night as any negative events at the feeder accumulate. Variable interval schedules work differently. In behavioral conditioning research, which Earl had never read and would not care about if he had, variable interval reinforcement produces stronger and more persistent behavioral responses than fixed interval reinforcement. The animal cannot predict when the reward will come, so it checks more frequently and approaches with higher arousal. Earl did not know the psychology term. He described it as, you want them thinking the feeder might have gone off an hour ago and they don't want to miss it. His feeder timer runs on a 7-day randomized schedule, meaning it fires at a different time each day across a range he sets of roughly 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. The corn is always going out during legal shooting hours, but the exact time changes every day. The sounder, which is the term for a family group of hogs typically led by a dominant sow, cannot build a fixed time arrival pattern around it. They have to check more often to catch the corn, and that checking behavior during daylight hours is what you are hunting. I want to be direct about my skepticism when he first explained this. I have been in enough conversations where experienced hunters describe their system with full confidence, and then the data tells a different story. I ran a parallel test on my Bladen County, North Carolina property over 8 weeks. I kept my existing fixed-time feeder running at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. at one location, and converted a second comparable setup to a randomized 2 to 8 p.m. window. Both sites had similar sounder activity on the cameras before the test. By week 4, the randomized setup was producing, on average, 4 times more daylight camera activity than the fixed-time setup. I will admit the sample size is one property and one comparison, and both sites had other variables I could not fully control. But a 4-to-1 ratio in daylight activity from what was essentially just a timer setting change was enough to change how I run every feeder I own. You have probably noticed this on your own cameras without naming it. Your feeder fires at 6 p.m., and most of your camera photos arrive at 6:15 or 6:20. The sounder is not investigating. They are committing on schedule. And then, one evening, you get a camera photo at 4 p.m., and you think the wind must have been perfect or the hogs were especially hungry. It probably was not the wind. It was probably that the hog visiting at 4 p.m. was doing a pre-confirmation check, arriving early to see if the corn had already been dispersed, because on that day, for whatever reason, that particular animal left the bedding area earlier than usual. The point is that the 4 p.m. photo represents a behavior you want to encourage. The 6:15 photo represents a behavior that works against you on a pressured property. Earl's system is designed to produce more 4 p.m. photos and fewer 6:15 photos. The regulation note here is quick because feeder and bait use is broadly legal for hogs on private land in most southern states. Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, all clear on private land. Public land has restrictions in every state, so check those specifically if that is where you are hunting. A 5-minute check on your state wildlife agency's website handles this. Here is the thing about how this interacts with sounder behavior at a biological level. A hog's olfactory system is estimated to be 5 to 7 times more sensitive than a dog's. They are scent-first navigators. They can detect corn from a significant distance, and on properties where feeders have been running for multiple seasons, the sounder knows those feeder locations by memory. They do not need to smell the corn to know where it is. What the randomized schedule does is change the question they are trying to answer from, "What time does the feeder fire?" to "Has the feeder fired yet today?" Checking that question requires a site visit rather than an arrival at a predicted time. More site visits during daylight hours means more shots for you. One self-correction before the second component. I described the 4-to-1 ratio in daylight activity on my Bladen County property as the result of the timer change alone. That is not fully accurate. I also changed camera placement on the randomized setup, moving the camera off the feeder post and onto a tree 40 yards downwind, which meant I was capturing approach corridor activity rather than only feeder commit activity. Some of the difference in photo counts between the two setups was the camera placement, not just the timer. I ran the comparison again the following season with matching camera placement on both setups, and the ratio was closer to 2.5 to 1 in favor of the randomized timer. Still meaningful, still consistent across both seasons, but I want to give an accurate picture of what the data actually showed rather than what my first interpretation was. The second component of Earl's system is the feeder quantity management, which he calls keeping them a little hungry. His feeders dispense enough corn for the sounder to eat for about 30 to 40 minutes, then there is nothing left. He does not load the feeder to capacity and run it twice a day until the sounder is fully satisfied. A sounder that eats its fill from a feeder and walks away satisfied has less behavioral urgency around that location than one that finds corn but runs out before all animals have eaten. The unsatisfied animals remember that the location ran short and return sooner. This is not a theory. Earl pointed to the camera data from his 3 feeders, which he has kept in paper notebooks since 2003, going back 20-plus years of observations from the same property. Feeders loaded lightly produced return trips within 4 to 7 hours on average. Feeders loaded heavily produced return trips after 12 to 16 hours. The light load feeders consistently had more daylight activity because the short feeding window pushed the sounder's next visit into earlier afternoon hours. If you are getting value from this, hit subscribe. More of these coming. The third component, which the reference script touched on briefly with good instincts, is trail camera placement relative to the feeder rather than on the feeder itself. Most hunters hang their camera on the feeder post or on the nearest tree pointing at the corn pile. Earl runs his cameras on a second tree, positioned 50 to 60 yards downwind of the feeder, pointed back toward the approach corridor. His reasoning: the camera on the feeder only captures animals that have already committed to the location. The camera 50 to 60 yards out captures the sounder's approach behavior, including the point where the dominant sow stops and scent checks before committing. That sow's behavior in those pre-commitment moments tells him more about the location's pressure status than anything the feeder camera can show. When the downwind camera shows the sow stopping at 60 yards and advancing normally, the location is clean. When it shows her stopping and reversing, the location has been compromised by recent human scent and needs a rest period regardless of what the feeder camera is doing. I want to add a self-correction on the randomized timer concept before someone in the comments asks about it. Not all feeder controllers have a true randomization function. The cheapest solution Earl uses is a mechanical timer that he resets manually every 3 to 4 days to a new time setting within his target window. This takes him about 30 seconds when he drives past on his ATV route. He is not going out specifically to reset the timer and contaminating the approach area with vehicle and foot scent. He adjusts from the vehicle without stopping near the feeder. If you have a smart feeder controller that supports randomized or multiple window scheduling, those work well too. The specific gear matters less than the underlying principle. Break the predictable time pattern. The 2-week pre-hunt protocol that produces most of Earl's kill count advantage is the component I spent the most time asking him about because it was the part that made the least intuitive sense until he explained the logic. 2 weeks before a planned hunt, Earl reduces his feeder loads by about 40%. Not by enough to stop the sounder from finding the feeder worth visiting, but enough that the sounder is consistently leaving the site with unsatisfied animals. Hungry animals make more site visits. More site visits during the 2 weeks before a hunt mean a higher total of positive, undisturbed experiences at the location building up in the sounder's assessment. By the time Earl hunts the feeder, the sounder has visited the location during daylight hours without a negative event dozens of times in the preceding 2 weeks. The threat association for that specific location has been driven down by volume of positive neutral visits, not by anything Earl did proactively. He just kept his human scent off the property and let the feeder do the work. The night of the hunt, he switches to a full feeder load at the randomized time. The sounder arrives to a location where corn is more abundant than it has been for 2 weeks. High corn abundance at a location with a strong recent positive experience history produces rapid, committed approach behavior. That is the combination that produces the 9 to 11 animal nights. The reduced loading during the prep period, combined with the randomized timing that keeps daylight visits frequent, combined with the clean approach to the property on hunt night, combined to produce a location the sounder treats as a low-threat, high-reward environment at the exact moment Earl is sitting over it. A hunter running a Jasper County, Texas lease posted a detailed account on Texas Hunting Forum a few years back where he had experimented with pre-hunt feeder load reduction without fully understanding the theory behind it. He described reducing loads 2 weeks before each planned hunt and noticing that his kill rates per hunt night went up significantly compared to hunts where he had been running the feeder at full capacity right up to the day of the hunt. He did not have a full explanation for why it worked and attributed it partly to luck. The mechanism Earl described, the positive experience accumulation theory, fills in that gap. The hunter on Texas Hunting Forum was observing the same effect without having named it. I found his thread after Earl explained the system to me, and the correlation was too specific to be coincidental. The limitation worth naming directly is that this system requires a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks of feeder establishment before the pre-hunt prep period begins. You cannot run a feeder for 1 week, do 2 weeks of reduced load prep, and expect the same result. The sounder needs enough established visits to the location that 2 weeks of additional positive reinforcement moves the needle meaningfully. On a cold start property, where hogs have just found a new feeder, the random timer alone will speed up sounder habituation, but the pre-hunt protocol does not apply until the sounder has made the location a regular circuit stop. Earl estimates his feeders need 6 weeks of activity before he considers them ready for the pre-hunt reduction sequence. On my Bladen County property, I found 8 weeks to be more reliable for that pre-hunt prep to produce the committed approach behavior I was looking for. Your terrain and your sounder's pressure history will determine where that threshold sits. The cost math on Earl's system is worth running because it actually saves money rather than adding to it. Running a feeder at reduced load during the 6-week establishment period and the 2-week prep period means you are dispensing less corn per week than a fully loaded feeder on a fixed schedule. Earl estimates he uses about 30% less corn per month than he would running his feeders at full capacity on a fixed schedule. At current corn prices, that is a meaningful reduction across 3 feeders over a season. The animals are getting enough to keep visiting and not enough to satisfy the full sounder. His cost per hog killed, which he has been tracking in his notebook since the early 2000s, dropped when he switched to this system not because he was killing more per sit, although he was, but because the per-hunt corn cost dropped at the same time. Running fewer pounds of corn and getting more animals per hunt is the right direction on both sides of the ledger. The payoff that Earl described last, and that I have validated on 2 properties over 3 seasons, is the feeder placement principle that he considers his single most important variable. He places every feeder within 30 to 50 yards, roughly the distance from home plate to the edge of the pitcher's mound, of a specific terrain feature he calls a confidence zone. On his property, these are thick brush patches, a standing group of cedar trees, or a point of timber that extends out toward the feeder location. The confidence zone is not where the feeder is. It is where the sounder can position itself to scent check the feeder before committing. If there is no natural confidence zone near a potential feeder location, Earl does not use that location regardless of how much sign is there. He will walk further to find a location where the approach geometry gives the sounder a cover point within 50 yards of the corn. The reason this matters for the overall system is that a sounder using a confidence zone to check a feeder before committing will stay in that zone for anywhere from 2 to 15 minutes before moving in. On Earl's downwind camera, this shows up as a stationary group at the edge of cover before the approach begins. The hunter who knows this is happening can be positioned to cover that approach corridor rather than sitting directly over the feeder. Earl hunts from a position between the confidence zone and the feeder, with wind from the confidence zone toward the feeder, so that approaching animals pass his position before reaching the corn. By the time a sounder is at the corn pile, they have already walked past his shooting position. He takes his shots on the approach rather than waiting for the animals to be at the feeder, where they are clustered tight and moving constantly. The approach corridor gives him animals in a natural walking pattern with predictable spacing, which produces cleaner shot selection and less sounder disruption per animal taken. My wife, when I described all of this after coming home from Earl's property, asked whether I had been overcomplicating hog hunting for 8 years by not talking to people who had been doing it longer. The answer, which I did not say out loud, was yes. Earl did not use a single piece of equipment that was not available in 1985. He had thought about the problem longer and more carefully than I had. A second Texas Boars thread is worth mentioning here, because it documents a similar feeder management approach from a South Texas perspective on heavier brush country terrain. The poster was running large sounders on Sendero Cut pasture in Dimmitt County and described a multi-year project of adjusting feeder timing and load levels to shift his kill distribution from predominantly late-night events to dusk and early evening. His timeline for the shift was about 4 months of systematic feeder management changes before he saw a consistent change in sounder arrival windows. He credited randomized timing as the single largest contributing factor and the reduced loading as the second. His conclusion after 4 months was that the changes had essentially doubled his effective hunting hours per season because he no longer needed to be there after midnight to see action. Same property, same sounders, different feeder management. The practical starting point if you want to test this on your own property is simple. Pick your best active feeder location. Change the timer to a different time every 3 to 4 days, staying within the 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. window if your goal is legal shooting light activity. Drop the load by 30 to 40%. Put a second camera 50 to 60 yards downwind pointed toward the approach corridor rather than at the feeder. Check both cameras remotely and let them tell you how the sounder is using the location before you ever hunt it. If the downwind camera shows sow approach behavior without reversal, the location is hunting ready. If it shows avoidance or reversal, something about the site has been compromised, and you need to find the source before you waste a sit. Run that system for 6 to 8 weeks, then begin the 2-week pre-hunt reduced load preparation. Hunt on a new moon or overcast night if you have the option. Walk in from the furthest practical parking point. Do not touch the feeder on the day of the hunt or the day before. The approach corridor hunting position Earl described is something the reference script touched on indirectly when it mentioned knowing wind direction and not hunting directly over the feeder on a bad wind. Earl's system is more specific than that. He does not think about the feeder position as his hunting position at all. The feeder is his draw. His hunting position is wherever the approach corridor runs between the confidence zone and the corn. On 3 of his 4 active sites, the approach corridor position is elevated, either a tree stand or a ladder stand, about 12 to 15 feet off the ground, positioned roughly 25 to 35 yards off the corridor on the crosswind side. Animals moving down the corridor toward the feeder pass his position perpendicular to his shooting direction, which is a cleaner shot angle than animals milling at a corn pile. He says he has killed roughly 80% of his animals in the last 10 years from the approach corridor rather than at the feeder itself. And he says anytime a sounder catches his scent at the feeder and spooks hard, they come back within 48 to 72 hours because their last experience at that location was positive and the corn is still there. A sounder that catches your scent in the approach corridor before they reach the feeder is a different problem. They have associated danger with a travel route rather than with a specific location, and that takes longer to reset. None of this requires new gear. Earl's whole setup cost him less than a good pair of hunting boots. The information it runs on is mostly just patience and paying attention to what the cameras are telling you.